transparency is often the solution that we turn to. We've heard more than once the quote that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but really the more open we can be about how the industry operates and the good that private equity does for companies, for the economy, the better positioned we are. And ILPA's advocacy over the years, and I've been very personally involved in this, has been how to not just talk about the benefits of private equity on companies and the benefits of private equity for LP returns, but also to be open and honest about what it costs to achieve those results and what do LPs pay for the benefit of getting access to those higher returns than they can achieve through a public market strategy alone.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Jen Choi, who is CEO of ILPA, the Institutional Limited Partners Association, where she has spent over a decade. She previously spent over 7 years at the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association. Welcome, Jen. Thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be with you.
Well, I'd love to start with a little bit about your background, initially where you grew up, what you studied, and then how you ultimately came to enter the world of private equity and LP advocacy.
Absolutely. So I'm a Midwestern girl. I grew up in a small town in Illinois called Rock Island and actually went to college in that town and was on a path to enter the world of diplomacy, I'd hoped. I majored in French and economics and political science and Asian studies. So spent some time overseas, actually spent a semester in France, a semester in Asia, and then went to teach English in Japan for a couple of years and was really setting myself up for a path to do some sort of work in international affairs, maybe the Foreign Service, with the ultimate aim of finding my way to Washington, D.C. I happen to live in Washington now and have for the last nearly 20 years, but I am not working in international diplomacy. I'm not working for the State Department, which is probably a good thing in today's environment. And in fact, found my way into private equity and LP advocacy entirely by accident. After I left graduate school, I landed in a recession in the dot-com bust, and I found my way to a consulting firm in Boston, Massachusetts that happened to specialize in private equity at the time. It was a startup that had been formed by a number of consultants who came from big firms and wanted to do things a bit differently and had built a real business for themselves doing due diligence work for GPs. So I had exposure at that time to the likes of the Carlyle Group and Hellman and Friedman and TA, got to know those firms, got to know private equity in a really interesting way, and did that for a few years and then learned of another startup in DC, which was IMPIA, now the GPCA, the Global Private Capital Association. But I found that to be an interesting way to marry the experience I'd built in private equity with a return to my original love, which was more of the international development world. Because at IMPIA, so many of the LPs investing into private equity and emerging markets at that time were actually focused on economic development. And a lot of the development finance institutions like the IFC, FMO, EBRD. And so that was a really fascinating journey. And I got to work both with GPs and LPs while I was at that association, and also got to partner with ILPA in ILPA's early days, got to know that executive director really well and the ILPA board members. And over a period of many years was lured to come work for ILPA. A position was created for me in 2014. And I took that opportunity, but under the condition that I would not move to Toronto, which was the headquarters at that time. And in fact, would open up the Washington, D.C. office. And I've been here ever since.
Well, that's a fascinating sets of twists and turns that I think it takes away the question about surprising turns. And fascinating also to think of that kind of marrying of the development aims with private equity, which aren't always two aims that we necessarily think of in the same context. And one of the previous podcasts on this series a little bit earlier in the year was with Eric Hirsch of Hamilton Lane. And he speaks about the private and private equity being maybe its own worst enemy, in the sense that sometimes the idea that we keep things private and perhaps of less transparency, more opacity, has been sometimes a problem for the industry. Have you seen an evolution of that private phenomenon around private equity throughout your career?
100%. And I'll just say that, in the 20 years or so, more than 20 years, I've been working in private equity and 20 years in associations. The issue of the industry's public reputation has come up again and again and again, and sometimes really culminates in a level of scrutiny from regulators, policymakers, activists that gets quite uncomfortable. And transparency is often the solution that we turn to. We've heard more than once the quote that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but really, the more open we can be about how the industry operates and the good that private equity does for companies, for the economy, the better positioned we are. And ILPA's advocacy over the years, and I've been very personally involved in this, has been how to not just talk about the benefits of private equity on companies and the benefits of private equity for LP returns, but also to be open and honest about what it costs to achieve those results and what do LPs pay for the benefit of getting access to those higher returns than they can achieve through a public market strategy alone. So going back to 2014, my first year at ILPA, it was just a few months after the famous Sunshine speech in May of that year, made by the then director of compliance and examinations at the SEC, Drew Bowden, regarding fees and expenses and allocation of fees and expenses in private equity, and some issues that SEC examiners had discovered in the early days of their role, really serving in a compliance and oversight capacity of private funds. And we began a very earnest discussion among the ILPA members at that time about how do we respond to this? There were a lot of activist groups who jumped on those headlines. There were a lot of inbound questions coming from boards, from trustees, from CIOs to the private equity teams within our member organizations who wanted to know, what does it really cost? Do we have the information that we need to make that assessment? Can we do apples to apples comparisons among the managers with whom we invest? Can we make active and informed decisions about the managers that we invest with that includes a fulsome accounting of what it costs to do so? And so in 2014 and 2015, we really focused on bringing a group of LPs and GPs together to create for the first time a template to capture those fees and expenses. So not just the management fees, not just the offsets to those management fees, but also the partnership expenses that are being borne by the fund that are not covered by the management fees. Fast forward to this year, we released an update to that template, reflecting conversations, obviously, that have ensued over the last decade, but also some of the issues that were brought forward by the SEC's proposed private fund advisors rules that were first put forward as a proposal in 2022, and ILPA engaged on that only to see the rule overturned by the Fifth Circuit in June of last year. But we really utilized the momentum created by the SEC's focus on these issues to bring the industry together. And when the rule fell away, actually saw that as an opportunity for the industry to take full ownership of what that information should be, what updates were required, how do we create something that's really robust and can sustain the industry across some of the more recent changes, but also for the future. And what we've seen is, again, a real embrace of benefits and the importance of transparency for limited partners. And the general partners have been along this journey with us right along the way.
And I presume, and we're going to get to a lot of the LP-GP relationship aspects, not just fees, but I presume the transparency has been a kind of a process of education as well, because I know when it comes, just in giving some context in Europe, much more embrace of alternatives by pension funds, but equally a focus on fees. And in a way, the two move sometimes in counter direction. The more use of privates, generally the higher overall fee load. And there can be a lack of understanding sometimes as to maybe how the performance fee works or how much it can actually end up being. How much does ILPA get involved in dealing with this new transparency and ensuring that it's properly understood and like for like?
It's a great question to be asking, Ethan, because certainly when you have more allocation of private markets and when those investments are successful, you're going to see higher costs as reflected by the carried interest paid to the GPs. Higher carried interest paid to the GPs is a reflection of stronger returns. So that's inherently a good thing, even though it's not intuitively a good thing for those who aren't as close to the industry. So this has been one of the challenges for LPs going back to the early days of the ILPA fee reporting template, because that was encompassing not just the fees, not just the partnership expenses, but the carried interest paid out as well. So we've certainly been part of that dialogue with our members and tried to support them in how they represent this information to their stakeholders. We don't often get between our members and their stakeholders in that dialogue, but certainly recognize that these are some challenges in terms of the education and the communication presented to those stakeholders where they need some additional support.
And, I suppose that's just going back to basics. You are the Institutional Limited Partners Association. How would you say the profile of the Institutional Limited Partnership looks today? A more experienced investor, clearly, after decades of doing this in some cases. Anything you can comment on in terms of how that investor profile has evolved?
Well, certainly we've seen the composition of institutional limited partners that are engaged as part of the ILPA community evolve over the last 20 years and the last decade that I've been with the association. We've seen real growth, of course, from sovereign wealth funds, from family offices. A lot of that is a reflection both of sophistication of private funds becoming a more prominent part of their portfolio. And also, speaking of the family offices for a moment, I think it's indicative of how their approach has evolved, where in the past they may have fully outsourced their private fund activities to a consultant, to a third party. They've hired up the teams, they've built up the investment offices to do that themselves. And that's reflected in our membership. Family offices today account for, I think, 16% of our 620 members. So we've seen real growth there over the last several years. But the institutional LPs themselves, I think it goes without saying that sophistication has been a real marker of the evolution over the last 2 decades. Co-investments, we've recently surveyed our members. Well over half of our members today have an active co-investments program. Many of them have dedicated staff focused on this. We're seeing increases in the ratio of co-investment relative to private funds commitments that they're making. So I'd say co-investment, maybe not so much direct investment as a broadly prevalent trend, but co-investment certainly is something that LPs have taken on. We've seen their private equity portfolios certainly evolve to encompass a wider breadth of strategies, a wider array of types of managers that they're investing with. And in more recent years, I would say we've seen a real evolution in how they think about some of the innovations in the marketplace. We can touch on continuation vehicles. We can touch on NAV facilities, how LPs are approaching those phenomena today looks different even than 2 or 3 years ago.
I'd love to go there now, then, in that case, because that's really, I think, at the cutting edge of innovation, too. How would you say? And also, it seems like some of the learning curves are getting shorter, like we're embracing new innovation maybe in a faster time cycle than might have been the case before. Can you talk about some of those innovations, whether it's continuation vehicles, NAV lending, other developments, and how LPs are involved in that?
Certainly, I think as a blanket statement, when we see these new strategies, new tools in the toolkit emerge, it's not irrational for the first reaction from LPs to be perhaps puzzlement, curiosity, concern. When it's something new and you don't yet fully understand, what does it mean? What does it mean for the performance of my portfolio? What does it mean for alignment of interest with my GPs? What does it mean in terms of conflicts that need to be managed in my GP relationship? So if we take any one of those things, if we take continuation vehicles, for instance, and ILPA release guidance on best practices regarding how LPs and GPs should be thinking about continuation vehicles in 2023, when it was a new phenomenon in the industry, what we saw was LPs asking questions around why is this the right solution? Why CVs relative to alternatives? Why now? When we first saw CVs emerge, we saw a worrying trend around these deals transacting early in the life of the fund, where some of the best assets were being extracted from the fund in, say, year 4, which we would have anticipated at the time that this was something better used later in the life of the fund when you really did need more runway for some of those prize assets. So there were a lot of questions early on around why this versus alternatives, why now in the life of the fund, how is the process going to unfold? Who were the buyers on the other side? How was the ultimate bid selected? What was the process for setting the valuation? What are the terms for those rolling into the new fund? What does that mean in terms of alignment with the GP? What kind of discount to NAV are the assets in the CV transacting at? All of those questions. Roll forward to today, I think what's most interesting to me is how LPs have really invested the time with their GPs to understand these things and have come to a much clearer understanding around what constitutes a good transaction versus a not good transaction. How do you recognize those things? How do you set yourself up as an LP to take advantage of the opportunity? So, as opposed to being a passive investor where you're confronted with a decision to roll or sell, but having to, by default, mostly sell because you don't have the internal governance protocols and the ability to take the discretion on an individual transaction. We're now seeing LPs in a position to evaluate these much in a similar fashion to how they might evaluate co-investment, and even thinking of these transactions in a similar vein. So that's been fascinating to see as part of the evolution for those LPs that have positioned themselves to actively prosecute a strategy around CVs and how their positioning posturing has changed and how they are approaching these not just as something that's happening to them perhaps, but as an opportunity set. So that's been really fascinating. On NAV facilities, again, when this first emerged, even though, NAV facilities or NAV-like facilities have been around for a long time, when these first emerged, there were a lot of questions around why is this the best of all alternatives, whether it's to generate liquidity or to provide additional support for an underlying asset or basket of assets. And I think, again, LPs and GPs have really invested in the time in sharing information. LPs have made the effort to get themselves educated. ILPA issued guidance last year, which I think also really helped to set the table in terms of what these facilities actually are and what they mean. There are still questions around what the impact of NAV facilities will be long term, but certainly feels like a much more mainstream tool than a few years ago, something that has a lot of potential for growth. We're just seeing a much more nuanced and sophisticated conversation around these things today than we did when they first emerged.
And it's interesting because that point about the maybe faster response times to co-investment or to continuation vehicles, it all speaks to a growing partnership approach between LPs and GPs, especially some of the very large LPs. And I suppose just, in the context of maybe a greater evolution of the LP GP relationship, we hear a lot about just the backdrop to private equity today, maybe fundraising being easy for some, not so easy for others. Do you see LPs generally having more chips at the table when it comes to negotiation these days?
It's a mixed story. I think things have improved slightly for the larger LPs. If we look at the LPs as a whole, I think the picture is probably a little more mixed or neutral. We're not seeing wholesale improvements or meaningful gains in fund terms the way one might have supposed in a more challenging fundraising environment. Where we're seeing improvement and in some terms tilting more in favor of the LP with respect to things like reporting and transparency. We're certainly seeing an improvement in the quality of dialogue that LPs and GPs are having. I referenced NAV facilities and CVs as two areas where they're simply talking more, I think, in talking in greater depth. Where we're not seeing as much improvement is in areas such as conflicts of interest. And that relates to how are conflicts being cleared. We can talk more about the advent of private wealth in semi-liquid structures alongside the fund and what issues that presents in terms of conflicts and how are LPs and GPs managing that together. But conflicts is one area. Another is costs and what expenses specifically are increasingly borne by the fund, by the limited partners, as opposed to covered under the management fee. And that pendulum has not come back. There's not a swing there in favor of the LP. If anything, more of the costs are being borne by the LPs than in years past.
That's very interesting because I suppose you would think with fee transparency, we would get to the bottom of that. But then if the fee only tells half the story and we need to look at the costs as well, which could, at least if the hedge fund world is anything to go by, could be potentially quite large or at least unlimited as we look at some of those costs. I think it's a good segue to that phenomenon around the democratization of alternatives. And even Larry Fink in his letter spoke about the democratization again, I think in this year's letter. So I'd say that that's clearly something that we've been focused on from many angles. We've seen platforms like KSI Capital develop to facilitate that, and huge amounts of resources being allocated to developing this pool, which may have been considered to be less sticky in the past, but now is seen as a good diversifier of an investor base. I suppose, how does ILPA's work fit alongside this phenomenon, and what should we be thinking about as it continues?
This is a core area of our focus in 2025. We're really trying to understand what are the key questions that LPs should be asking their GPs around their current activities in this space and their intentions to raise capital through these vehicles in the future if they're not currently doing so. Some of the key issues that keep coming up relate to how will deals be allocated. So will the semi-liquid vehicle get first pass at co-investment, or will certain transactions be allocated to that vehicle ahead of the fund? There are questions around how costs, for example, broken deal expenses, will be allocated between these vehicles and the funds, the more traditional commingled funds. There are questions around time and attention of the GP. We asked this question of a group of GPs just a couple of weeks ago, and I think we're a bit surprised by the high number that are already raising capital specifically for these semi-liquid vehicles, whatever platform they might be using, whether they're doing it with a dedicated in-house team or through an intermediary, or, such as the platforms that you mentioned. So it's already here. It's already here at scale. LPs are confronted with a learning curve here. So again, similar to other emerging phenomena in the past, LPs are endeavoring to really understand, what does this mean for my relationship with the GP and our alignment? What does it mean for the performance of the fund in terms of which deals get allocated where, the additional costs and how those are distributed? And what does it mean as far as the need to satisfy the appetite for liquidity in those vehicles that sit outside of the fund but are investing alongside of them? So these are all questions that we're very focused on, and we expect this year we'll have a lot more to say to guide the institutional LPs in terms of how to anticipate or how to approach their GPs who are either contemplating or already raising capital in this way.
I think thank you for this advocacy, because I do think that holding GPs to account is so important, especially as things are moving very quickly, because then things become normalized. And I think so we sort of feel that that time has passed. So I think thinking through things a little bit more slowly and methodically helps. We probably get some of the sunlight, as you mentioned, onto these topics. Just, you mentioned that is a priority for ILPA in 2025. Any other things at the top of your list as you look to the rest of the year and beyond?
Well, I would actually stay on this topic of private wealth and retail capital in these semi-liquid structures, just to call out that we know there is tremendous interest from Washington to provide more access to private funds for retail investors. And by retail in this, it's very important to be precise in our language here. By retail in this instance, I'm referring to defined contribution plans and 401k investors and the like. And so as an industry, it's critical that we come together and really have a view, an aligned view on what that should look like. And how do we ensure that however it's done and however quickly this change might take place, that it happens in such a way that the investors already in private funds aren't harmed, and that it's done so in a responsible way and in a transparent way. So I think that has to continue to be top of mind, not just for ILPA, but for all of our allies and aligned organizations and our members and the GPs in our engagement with the policymakers here in Washington. In addition to that work, we continue to focus on how our members are investing in private credit, and how the work that ILPA has done over the last 20 years sets us up to be helpful to them and their investments in that space. There are a lot of similarities in how LPs approach private credit to how they approach private equity, but they are fundamentally different strategies. And so we're taking a close look at how we can build out our executive education, our guidance, our templates to be of best use to our members who are investing into private credit. And then the third thing I would mention is that we opened an office in London in 2023. That team continues to grow in serving our members and the industry in Europe. And at the same time, we're spending much more time on the ground in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So really trying to bring ILPA to where our members are, make sure we're serving our membership in the industry globally in a more profound way.
Well, fantastic. And I look forward to seeing the impact globally. As I said, we are kind of at a phase of flooding of the zone with new strategies, new information, and just pressure to get invested for some and get disinvested by others. So I do think that that's staying the course of navigating through this education is critical. I'd love to turn to some reflection questions now, just to close us out. So private equity is a land filled with war stories, ups and downs, tall tales, and beyond. Any particular lessons learned in your career that you've learned lessons from that you can share here?
Not to get too deep into the specifics, but I think on more than one occasion, I've discovered how important it is not just to know what you want, but what you don't want. So that's really helped me at a couple of pivotal moments to avoid making changes at the wrong time or making the wrong changes at the right time. So I think making sure that we're all taking active time to reflect, not just on what we want, but what we don't want is really critical.
And similarly, I think it's also a field filled with large personalities. And I started my career on the legal side of LLP work. And again, lots of personalities there as well. Was there anyone in particular throughout your career, any person, whether from your career or otherwise, that's had a particular impact on you?
No one person, but I would just call out that I've had the pleasure of working alongside dozens of individual LPs who've served on the ILPA board. And they are some of the most insightful and most generous people I've had the pleasure of knowing, and have supported me, partnered with me, challenged me, evolved my thinking, really helped me grow as a person and as a professional. And I won't embarrass any of them by calling them out by name, but they know who they are, and there are many of them.
Well, I love that. Well, we had Victoria Barbary of the International Foundation of Sovereign Wealth Funds on a previous podcast just last week. And I think bringing together LPs of this stature in a forum where they are not necessarily being sold to, and sometimes on the defensive as a result, can really bring great sharing of best practice. So I can imagine in ILPA you have a similar chemistry and energy.
Certainly do.
And my final question is around any creed or motto that you live by, or a word of advice that you can leave us with, something that maybe you've learned over the years or recently that you can leave us with.
Well, it's interesting. Years and years ago, when I was a young consultant in Boston, I had this quote on my desk that I had attributed to Nelson Mandela. And I'll read it to you, and then I'll tell you who really said it. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. So that's a quote you've probably heard before. It's not Nelson Mandela. It's actually Marianne Williamson, which I was stunned to find out. But I've always found that to be very inspiring, especially as a woman in this industry. I think it's very easy to shrink, to make the room for others. And it takes something special to not do that, to not be afraid of our light, to not be afraid to show up for others, to say the hard thing. So that's been something I've carried with me through my career.
Well, that's a beautiful quote. I'll try to get all of it in the show notes to transcribe it, to fully let people take it in. But I think it's very appropriate that we ended this conversation discussing light, because we started it discussing light and sunlight in particular, and transparency. And I do think that to go to another, which I think is another African proverb, but is around going far together. And certainly each individual LP has tremendous power, but together, and together with your advocacy, can go even farther. So thank you so much, Jen, for the work you're doing at ILPA, for all your team around the world, and for coming here to share your insights with us.
It's been a true pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.